From gay rights to the country's relationship with the EU, it's a clash of values in Poland's presidential runoff between incumbent nationalist Andrzej Duda and his liberal rival, Rafał Trzaskowski. Donald Trump, the leader of the worst-hit country by the pandemic, finally wears a face mask in public, months after health experts warned everyone should use them, and as cases in the U.S. top 3.2 million. And the UN Security Council passes a resolution to restart aid deliveries into war-torn Syria. But the deal will use just one border crossing rather than two, potentially punishing millions of Syrians in need. Voting has begun in Poland's presidential runoff, which is being closely watched by the European Union. The outcome could have a major impact on the independence of the country's courts, gay rights, and relations with the EU. If incumbent Andrzej Duda is reelected, then Poles can expect 5 more years of hardline conservative policies. But it's expected to be a tight race with a more liberal mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, who has said he would defend minorities and democratic values. Our correspondent Gulliver Cragg reports from the capital.
There's really a huge amount of interest in this election. People are saying it's the most important election in a generation. In Poland, normally it's the parliamentary elections that are more important. It's a parliamentary presidential system where the president's powers are quite limited, but they do include the power to veto legislation that's put forward by the parliament. And that's why some people are seeing this election not so much as a choice between two presidential candidates, but as a sort of referendum on the government led by the Law and Justice Party or PiS. The question is, in a way, do you want PiS to be allowed to continue its radical transformation of the Polish political system, changes that have been so strongly criticised by the European Union and which are seen by many people here in Poland and elsewhere in Europe as a dangerous authoritarian drift? Rafał Trzaskowski certainly presents himself as the pro-democracy candidate. At his rallies, they even play one of the most famous rock songs of the 1980s that was an anthem of the fight against communism, and certainly a lot of people feel that the things are that bad that they're really fighting to defend democracy in Poland. Other people, though, see those comparisons with the 1980s as absurd and perhaps even almost offensive. After all, Poles' living standards today are light years away from what they were in the 1980s. Things are much better, and in particular for poorer Polish people, they have definitely improved living standards in the last 5 years since Andrzej Duda became president.
So if this election is a referendum on the Law and Justice Party, tell us, if Duda does win, what will be the ruling party's next move?
Well, there have already been a number of proposals put forward by leading politicians from the ruling party. One is they're very unhappy about the way the private media treat them, some private media anyway, who are critical of the government, and quite a lot of those media are owned or part owned by a German-Swiss concern, and ruling party politicians routinely suggest that this is the German government trying to impinge on Polish politics via this media. There's no evidence for German government influence on those media, I hasten to add. But they say that they want to re-Polonize private media. A lot of journalists are worried that that could mean basically a government takeover of the private media sphere as after they've already taken over the public media. So that's one thing that some people are worried about. There's also a third phase, if you will, of the judicial reform. The government has already substantially increased its control over the court system. That's one of the main things that the European Union is worried about. There's a new reform that's been proposed which would cover the common courts and which would essentially, to cut a very complicated story short, allow the government to replace numerous judges that it considers to be inconvenient.
U.S. President Donald Trump, who has mocked people who wore face masks, used one in public for the first time. It took repeated urging from aides that it was necessary to send a message to Americans who are skeptical about covering their faces. Trump has been criticized for downplaying public health guidelines as the coronavirus rages across the country with over 3.2 million confirmed cases and more than 130,000 deaths.
Featuring the presidential seal in a classic navy blue, it was a first for the U.S. president. When visiting wounded U.S. troops, Donald Trump wore a face mask. Before the trip, he explained his decision to reporters.
I think when you're in a hospital, especially in that particular setting where you're talking to a lot of soldiers and people that in some cases just got off the operating table, I think it's a great thing to wear a mask. I've never been against masks, but I do believe they have a time and a place.
Up until now, the US president has been reticent to wear a mask in public, despite public health guidelines advising of their importance. A stance that has politicized the protective gear, with many Trump supporters refusing to use them. The US remains the worst affected country globally by COVID-19, with over 3 million confirmed cases and more than 130,000 deaths. And infections continue to surge. Southern and western states have been particularly hard hit, Florida among them, with 10,000 new cases reported just this Saturday. But despite the statistics, Disneyland has reopened its flagship theme park in Orlando this weekend. Visitors will have to wear masks and social distance in an effort to prevent the spread of the coronavirus.
France's prime minister is expected to arrive in French Guiana for a quick one-day visit focused on the pandemic. The French Overseas Department has recorded more than 5,000 cases and 21 deaths, but authorities predict the peak has not been hit, so numbers will continue to climb. Flights to France have been suspended and a health emergency extended until late October. Well, thousands of Israelis gathered in downtown Tel Aviv to protest the government's handling of the pandemic, in particular, the economic hardship caused by restrictions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has seen his popularity plummet as unemployment has surged over 20%. Let's listen to some of the protesters.
We are not working already nearly 5 months, and unfortunately most of us have not received any compensations from the Israeli government, and this is really a tragedy. That's mean how you can feed your family, that's mean and paid your employees, etc. after 5 months with zero income. This is unbelievable. In every country all over the world, people have received compensations and support from their government. Unfortunately, here in Israel, nothing yet.
The Prime Minister says he wants to help, but he doesn't do anything. And the past shows that he speaks a lot and does nothing. And we know he did the same thing about a month ago. He promised a lot. People didn't get the help they promised.
After a week of division and multiple ballots, the UN Security Council passed a resolution to restart cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria. Ultimately, the council caved to Russian pressure to close one of 2 access points into the war-torn country. And that could mean millions of Syrians will not get access to sorely needed supplies. Yinko Yatade has the story.
For the millions of Syrians currently displaced around the country, humanitarian aid is a lifeline they have depended on since 2014. Now the UN's decision to maintain deliveries to Syria through just one border rather than 2 will pay a painful blow to the 2.8 million Syrians in need in the northwest.
ما كفى الإجرام الروسي بالقصف في الطائرات وبدأوا بملاحقتنا على لقمة عيشنا التي هي مصدر دخلنا الوحيد ألا وهي الأمم المتحدة والمساعدات التي تأتينا من الخارج وقاموا بحق نقض الفيتو وقتلنا جوعا وكان هذا أصعب من قصف طائراتهم وكيماوي بشار الأسد يعني هذا.
The newly approved resolution will end the delivery of aid through the Bab al-Salam border crossing, leaving just the Bab al-Hawa crossing as the only viable routes for aid to come through. A decision that Russia, a key ally to the Bashar al-Assad regime, was banking for. The Idlib region is partly rebel-held, and the regime and its allies want more control over aid entering the territory. Aid workers now fear, though, that the onset of COVID-19 will worsen the plight of millions of displaced Syrians after a handful of cases were reported in Idlib province. But humanitarian groups fear that there are far more. They say that the virus would spread like wildfire through overcrowded camps and that the medical system that has been ravaged by war will not be able to cope.
In a bid to quell protests calling for his resignation, Malian President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta announced the dissolution of the Constitutional Court. The court had sparked protests when it overturned provisional results for a parliamentary poll back in April. But there's also been widespread anger over a long-running jihadist conflict, economic woes, and perceived government corruption. James Wilson has more.
The streets of Bamako are still tense after Friday's anti-government protests, when thousands came out calling for the resignation of Malian President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. At least 3 people died and dozens more were injured. Saturday saw scattered groups come out, and although the police fired tear gas at them, no serious incidents of violence were reported.
On continue à faire ces barrages-là ici jusqu'à la démission du président. S'il ne démissionne pas, nous, on est là 24 heures sur 24 heures. On va continuer ce lutte-là jusqu'à la mort. On ne reste pas. On est là pour ça. On est sorti pour ça. Nous, on ne s'assoit pas. On fait comme ça jusqu'à le jour que Ibeka va quitter.
The protests are led by the 5th of June movement, with an imam called Mahmoud Dicko at their head. It's a coalition of religious leaders, politicians and ordinary citizens who blame the president for a failure to resolve a long-running war with jihadists, a weak economy and perceived corruption. They argue that change at the top is needed. However, the government has called instead for dialogue and offered to form a new open cabinet.
Il est dans son intention et dans la mienne de très rapidement mettre en place un exécutif resserré pour rétablir rapidement et dans les meilleurs délais l'ordre dans notre pays et réfléchir aux défis.
The 5th of June movement have rejected the offer. On Saturday afternoon, police raided their headquarters and have arrested several senior figures.
At least 5 people are dead after an attack on one of South Africa's biggest and richest churches. Police and military responded to reports of a shooting at the International Pentecostal Holiness Church near Johannesburg. Authorities believe that the violence was triggered by a leadership dispute, and more than 40 people have been arrested.
Supposed to be a place of peace, this beleaguered church in South Africa was turned into a battleground early on Saturday. 5 people were shot and killed when armed men stormed the International Pentecostal Holiness Church headquarters.
We've arrested over 41 suspects, including 6 who have been taken to hospital, purportedly after suffering certain injuries and gunshot wounds. And we also seized over 40 firearms, including rifle, shotguns and handguns.
This photo of people lying on the ground after being arrested was published by South African police on their social media accounts. Among them, not just the usual suspects, but employees from the Defence Forces, correctional services and even police. Authorities also liberated some 200 men, women and children who appeared to be held hostage and were living in the church. Initial investigations suggest the attack could have been orchestrated by breakaway church members who've been at war over who should take the reins after the death of its leader, Clayton Mdize, in 2016, which led to one man being stoned to death. Then, in 2017, the 2 groups went to court over reports that almost €6 million were missing from church funds. And a year later, 3 people were injured as members threw stones and fired bullets at each other.
A new exhibition entitled Être Libre, or To Be Free, showcases 50 years of work by the French anti-establishment artist Ben. Considered a provocateur, the artist writes messages on postcards, paintings, or school kits, and more than 400 works are on display at the Chamarande Castle south of Paris. Well, that's the news for now. Thanks for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.
When we handle first-hand information, we have always to be careful and to verify this information. The latest example that I had to treat was a hint that I got from a North American source regarding French children that are going to be brought back from Syria to France. It's a very touchy subject. So when I got in touch with French institutions that handle those issues, I wasn't able to get any final confirmation or official confirmation. So I was forced to retain the info, despite the fact that 24 hours after that, indeed, French children were brought back to France. And this is one of multiple examples where we are forced to retain information until it is confirmed or verified.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.